Yuval V.S. is an attorney. He's a principal at the Alberti Group in the Chicago area. I've known Yuval for about 5 years now. I find he has a very educated and informed opinion. His firm, the Alberti Group, brings together highly qualified professionals with expertise in risk management, law, architecture, construction, building systems, and forensic assessment. They help owners, design professionals, and contractors to better define their sustainability goals, manage risk, and achieve performance. Yuval is also an adjunct professor at DePaul University, where he teaches a course on sustainability in real estate. And in 2012, he received a President's Citation from CSI from Paul Bertram for his contributions to CSI during the year. And with that, I'm looking forward to your presentation, Yuval.
Well, thanks very much, Mark and Matthew. I appreciate the opportunity to do this. And this is sort of a bit of a work in progress. I have been asked by the American Bar Association Forum on the Construction Industry to work on a series of topics and write a chapter. And this is an initial go at some of the issues that I'm going to be addressing in that chapter. And what I'd like to talk about today is what I think of as a pretty crucial issue in dealing with sustainability. And that is, of course, as the title says, is it really about advocacy or is it about objectivity? And especially when it's a specifier or a design professional, especially a licensed design professional, who is providing the type of advice that we're talking about here. So, as Mark mentioned, I'm actually an attorney. Please don't hold that against me. As you can see, I taught the history, theory, and design at architecture schools, both at the graduate and undergraduate level. So I have some glancing familiarity with this world. And of course, I do a lot of work in risk management and policy and a number of other things. But really what I've encountered in the last about 7 to 10 years of being in this area is that, the area of green building is, of course, very, very important. It certainly is important to me. I think it's a very crucial issue. But it's also full of exaggerations, half-truths, sometimes intellectual dishonesty, sadly, and advocacy of various types by many of the parties. And so this really ends up not to be a very good situation when you're after what, frankly, I'm after, which is outcome-based sustainability. And that phrase really comes from, as some of you may know, the outcome-based philanthropy, which is at the core of the Gates Foundation. And that the core difference between the Gates Foundation and other philanthropic organizations is that they really are interested in the outcome. And they're very, very concerned about the number of people who actually get vaccines as opposed to the black tie party that says everybody's contributing to the potential for somebody getting a 1,000 miles away or 10,000 miles away getting the right vaccine. So that their decisions, both in terms of economics and in terms of their policy, is based very, very much on trying to get to the outcome. And I really think that sustainability should be about outcome. But I'm going to tell you what it often is at the moment. And at the moment, often it's split into 3 areas. One, on the very left, you see there's sort of a pure philanthropic motion or a notion of this, and it's often deals with some notion of community or often vanity activity by various funds or foundations or so forth. And really it's based on community outreach, some kind of self-affirmation, and you can see some of the other issues that are involved, but it's primarily driven by an ideological need. Much of what goes on now, of course, in sustainability is really driven by marketing. And in that sense, the real core issues here are a market analysis, brand differentiation, and a series of other things. But they're primarily a way to use marketing as a way to drive brand differentiation and revenue to various organizations, whether they're NGOs, whether they're private sector, or whether they're public sector entities. And of course, what I'm particularly interested in, and I think this is the most important thing in terms of talking about sustainability, is to be able to get to the outcome, get to the real performance, make sure the economics are solid so that sustainability can actually be sustainable over time. And here you've really got to have some measurement and verification. Risk management is very, very crucial. You have to have objective data, and you've got to do often an economic analysis to understand what's going on. And so I differentiate these three areas by ideology, marketing, and prudence. And prudence, of course, is something that has a long, long history in human sort of existence and thinking about what to do with limited resources, limited time, limited funds. and how to act under conditions of uncertainty, and that's really been defined in human action as prudence. So, in terms of dealing with specifiers, and why I think, especially in terms of specifiers, I'm sort of interested in how sustainability can overlap with them. I may have a disproportionate view of specifiers in the sense that I give them a lot of credit. Most of the specifiers I've ever met certainly are individuals who I think take great pride in what they do, and separating the fluff from the substance, as I say, is the first thing here. But the more I encounter them, the more I have a sense that they have a healthy skepticism. And they have to have a healthy skepticism given who they are and the positions that they find themselves in. And rejecting that healthy skepticism for advocacy is part of the difficulty that I think a lot of them may encounter in dealing with sustainability. So one of the things that's crucial is that caveat emptor is at play. And the specifier provides real value to his employer, and I believe this very strongly, and clients by acting as a filter to keep out the junk. What do I mean by junk? It's the same thing you guys have always been dealing with as specifiers and as people involved in this whole process of the construction project. Product reps, contractors, manufacturers, many other parties come to the table having some kind of interest in making revenue out of the project. And often the specifier is one of the first and most important hurdles that has to be productively jumped by these entities to show that the products that they have, the systems that they have, whatever it is, fulfills some baseline of objectivity, both in terms of data and in terms of the methodology used and in terms of the credibility and reliability of that information. I guess basically I feel like specifiers are in that initial chain of design professionals, those who have the most predilection for being skeptical. On the other hand, many specifiers have a professional status, which is that they're also a licensed professional, a licensed design professional. And a licensed design professional, and I'm going to say this right off the screen just to repeat it but to make a point, a licensed design professional is a member of a learned profession, and that's important. Learned professions are held in particularly high esteem by the state, and they're expected to do significantly more than professions that are not thought to be as learned professions. You could be a barber, but that's not considered to be a learned profession. You could be a certified barber, you could be a professional barber, but you're not a member of a learned profession. And even though in certain cases the state may grant barber certification, certain types of monopolies to cut hair, the type of monopoly granted by the state to provide services in the realm of building assets of the state to help protect the health, welfare, and safety of the general public is the kind of thing that the design professional gets. And the state expects a licensed professional to exercise his learning, make judgments about compliance and risks associated with health, safety, and welfare embodied in the built asset flow of society, not to advocate for personal views or beliefs. This is a very crucial distinction. There's nothing wrong with having your personal views or beliefs about the status of the world, the status of sustainability, the status of what you may think about Britney Spears. Those are all completely adequate to hold. But as a design professional, the monopoly granted to you by the state is not to advocate for personal views or beliefs, except under certain circumstances, and we'll talk about that later. And then the standard of care under which professionals are judged are not based on personal views and your advocacy of certain positions. So one of the things to remember here is that, Oliver Wendell Holmes had a great quote long ago. He said, "Certitude does not equal certainty." And this is where, when you talk about advocacy and you talk about skepticism, it's crucial. The fact that one believes something so incredibly deeply, that the level of one's certitude is extremely high, does not at the same time guarantee its certainty. And this is what the design professional knows. This is what the state has given the monopoly to the design professional or the learned professional for. In the same way that a doctor may be deeply committed to alternative medicine or to Freudianism or be almost certain that the Jungian view of life is the true view of life, when he practices medicine, he doesn't get to substitute that view for his professional judgment and his professional capacity to help his patient or client make intelligent decisions. This is a very crucial distinction. It is often elided, both in terms of the architecture firms that specifiers often work for, and occasionally among specifiers themselves, because they believe that somehow this is a way for them, a conduit for them, to do something good for the world. Now, as you can see, states extract a legal duty for the monopoly position given to licensed professionals, and here I give the example of the Reiki massage therapist, and you know, there are many other examples that could be given. Non-professionals do not have this wider duty. That is, if you're not a licensed professional, you don't have this wider duty. But at the same time, I think there is a need to be very aware of the ethical duties, even if you're a non-professional, about how you act in this regard. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I've got only about 25 slides, but when I say only, one knows that 25 slides probably can easily take up the full amount of time, and I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions. So many of you already know this, have experienced it firsthand, and that's your life. For 20 years you've been dealing with this. Product rep comes to the office, gee whiz, he's got a new product and it's going to make your HVAC efficiency 30% greater because there's some new magic LED technology he's going to use. He provides you the marketing material and a self-funded case study of an installation. Okay, now there's a licensed professional. He's a vocal advocate for green and sustainable buildings in the office. Could be you as a specifier. So, as such, you or he loves the idea and recommends the new tech without doing full due diligence if the technology works or if the study data is either adequate or methodologically sound. Well, I mean, obviously this is a straw man example. You're not supposed to do this. I assume none of you do this. And I use that little quotation at the very end that, but mom, all the other kids are doing it. You know darn well isn't an adequate reason for you to go ahead and do it. And one of the things to remember is that each of you who is a licensed design professional has a specific and independent duty to act in a particular manner, which doesn't matter whether you're employed with a larger firm or not. You have an independent duty to act. Well, I'll explain that further as we go. So I'm going to give you a sort of harsher example just so that we're all on the same page and you understand why I have such a strong sense of why advocacy is not a particularly good thing to do except under very controlled circumstances. So the child has cancer and has less than a year to live, and the parents are very interested in alternative medicine. The licensed physician in this case is also very interested in alternative medicine, and he also knows that surgery will provide a 75% rate of survival for the patient. So the doctor has seen a single non-repeatable study that recommends voodoo for treating the child's cancer. The doctor wants to promote alternative medicine. He's an advocate for alternative medicine, so he recommends the voodoo option to the parents without indicating the rate of survival or robustness of the study data or methodology or comparison to surgery survival rates. Again, obviously a straw man example, but I think it's worth noting here. You know that if it really matters, if your child or your spouse or somebody else has cancer or has a condition and you really want the outcome to be good, you do not accept bogus studies, bad data, and certainly you never expect your doctor to substitute his personal views for the proper information to be provided to you to make an intelligent decision. As such, it's very, very crucial to understand that advocacy almost always crosses the line if you do not inform your patient or client that you are in fact presenting an opinion, not a judgment about the status of a particular system or option that you're laying before them. So, as I've already said, the state doesn't provide monopoly to a profession to exercise opinions in the service of society. Now, architects in general have always been confused about this. I know a lot of people will, there's a lot of brouhaha about this when I say things like this, but the history of architecture, the internal sociology of architecture, and the educational indoctrination which most architects undergo, and certainly I was part of that process for quite a long time when I taught architects, And frankly, I was aghast at the kind of indoctrination that they were forced to endure. But the outcome of this is that they come to believe that they're rightful agents of a cultural, social, or aesthetic change and must save the benighted owners or society from themselves. And this has always been a rather odd position to hold, given the level of knowledge that most architects possess to be able to solve these types of global problems. But it's a conceit of the field, and it has been a conceit of the field for certainly 200 years or more, that by making buildings have a particular look, a style, a historical attribute, that in and of itself would be enough to have significant influences not only on the behavior of the occupants, but of the nature of society and where it was going. Now, we certainly don't need to go into a long discussion about the theory of the avant-garde and a whole series of other things that have been at the core of much of this, but it's very clear that architects remain somewhat confused about their role. Is it an aesthetic role? Is it a cultural role? And they come to believe that they possess special knowledge. So this relation between the deeply rooted view of the architect that architects are at the center of saving the world, either through green design, or previously it was because they were doing buildings that looked modern, or they were buildings that displayed their structure, or they were in the Gothic style, or they were in whatever style it was, that they were going to save the country or save society or take society into a brave new future or whatever it was. There's an illusion between that and the world of green design. And as I say here, it's almost too easy. And as you'll see, the AIA, in terms of a series of things that it's done, has sort of fallen prey to this. Because when you're talking about green or sustainability, there's a lot of rhetoric about trying to save the planet, save the world, save the environment, make the world a better place. And somehow, naturally or unnaturally, architects have come to believe that that is part of their purview. Previously, they thought they did it through aesthetics, through formal manipulation, and the use of green has become another sort of adjunct to this theory. So the habit of advocacy for personal form, which is often the standard world of architecture, and here we're talking about design architects, we're not talking about, let's put it this way. There are some specifiers who share this, but one of the most interesting things about specifiers is they tend to be individuals who see this as being slightly overwrought in terms of many design architects. So I'm going to give you a quotation from an old friend of mine, Fred Butters, who wrote on this topic a while ago, and this was almost 2008, so what are we talking about? It's 2013, so it's almost 5 years ago now. But he is exactly on point here, and I give you the references so you know where it's from, and it's easy to access, and in fact it's part of a volume of a special issue that was done almost 5 years ago. So excuse me while I quote this for a couple of minutes here, but I think it's useful. So, for example, an architect may know full well that there is conflicting or contradictory evidence for the use of a certain product or system, but demurs at providing the owner with this full disclosure of the current state of the evidence. Instead, he advocates and encourages by providing only positive and glowing reports of the product or system under consideration. One thing to remember here, and this is a very crucial distinction, you should understand that the lead product, the lead rating system is actually a product. And it is understood to be so commercially. So is the GBI Green Globes rating system, so is FAIA. All of these things are actually products. So as specifiers, you need to assess those products and understand the underlying value of those products and claims of those products in the same way that you would do of any other kind of product. So I continue with the quote. The architect, let me just redo that last sentence. Instead, he advocates and encourages by providing only positive and glowing reports of the product or system under consideration. The architect has now become an advocate, not a professional. This puts the architect in a sticky position. Is he an advocate first and professional second, or vice versa? While the interplay of advocacy, truth, and ethics may not seem significant, on closer examination it is apparent that they are indeed aligned concepts. While the architect who simply evaluates options and educates the client so that the client can make an intelligent choice is likely rendering truthful and ethical advice, is the architect who takes an additional step and actually advocates for a particular result also doing so? Can an architect advocate for a particular approach only if he or she actually knows that approach is in the client's best interest, even though that approach might be in the interest of the planet or the greater public good? Question mark. Where the architect actually becomes an advocate, is the resultant advice a product with truth and ethics, or is it a product of advocacy? If the advice is a product of advocacy, the legal privilege and its attendant defense are lost. Say that again. If the advice is a product of advocacy, the legal privilege and its attendant defense are lost. On its surface, the AIA definitions of ethical and advocacy now appear to be, at least to a degree, interchangeable, and we'll talk a little bit about those AIA definitions in a second. Consistent with the overall educational purpose behind the architect's approach, does the architect now have a duty to inform the client that his or her, quote, sustainable, end quote, advice, it may not be what is in the best interest of that particular client, but may be in part the product of sustainable advocacy? Now, Fred goes on, but I think it's important to understand that there's a very important implication for engaging in advocacy, and engaging in advocacy without thinking through clearly when you can do it and when you cannot do it. And ultimately, that there are significant implications, both legal and, in fact, I've had some detailed conversations with some folks who are insurance underwriters in preparation for this discussion. There are some real questions as to whether advocacy is covered under E&O policies. So, when can you engage in advocacy? And I think it's important. I mean, there are many people who want to engage in advocacy. Let's understand when it can be done and what the limits of it are. Advocacy requires informed consent. You know all about informed consent when you're dealing with your doctor. Now, the fact that there is no informed consent theory in architecture is quizzical. There are explanations for this historically, but clearly in most of the other, if not all the other professions, certainly law requires informed consent, so does medicine. You have to have it from the owner or client, and the architect educates the client to make intelligent choices. This is what you're supposed to do. Let's make sure we understand what informed consent means. And one of the interesting historical issues here is that informed consent does not actually arise in the world of physicians until really the 50s. And it comes about as a result of the Nuremberg trials, where obviously doctors came to experiment on people without their knowing it and believed that they were doing so for the greater good. Same thing happened in a series of trials that dealt with treatments for VD in the Tuskegee Airmen scenario. There are a number of other cases in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that lead to the notion that one of the requirements of being a licensed professional as a physician is that you must acquire the informed consent of your patient before you engage in treatment. And you must provide them with or educate them in a manner so that they can make an intelligent, informed choice. So informed means that the professional must. So this is not an optional thing. Informed means that the professional must do the level of due diligence necessary to understand fully the nature of the information that creates the basis of the option provided to the owner or client party. So you can't just be guessing, you can't just be hoping, or you can't just be praying that the stuff you're saying in the study you happen to be citing makes sense, because it happens to comport with what you want. The USGBC provided this PowerPoint, for example. This is a study by a Green advocate. This is an internal research report produced by advocates for Green at this architecture firm. All of those things have to be revealed, so that you can't, as was often done early on and as continues to be done now, architecture firms trot out a pre-prepared PowerPoint provided by the USGBC or Green Globes or some organization, and then trot it out as part of their presentation to an owner, trying to convince them that, hey, asset valuation goes up because the USGBC has said X, Y, and Z. That's not adequate. That's functioning as an advocate. And if you do not reveal this to your client, you're not actually getting informed consent. You're getting misinformed approval. Okay? So informed in this context means You have to know both sides, and you have to present both sides to the client for review and selection, because it's the only way you can educate the client to make an intelligent choice. That's what they rely on you for. That's why you're a learned profession. That's why the state gives you a monopoly. So, of course, we remember the example of a child with cancer. The doctor must do due diligence on all treatment options and then present them to the parent or the patient with relevant information for making the decision. The patient client may ask for the design professional doctor's views about the choice, but the professional must reveal any personal views or conflicts of interest that would color his recommendations. Sure, I mean, as an attorney, I get this all the time. But what should I do? I mean, I know you've given me these three options, but what would you do? Well, if I respond, I have to make it very clear why I choose that option. Okay? And you may have to say, well, this is just my opinion. For example, the doctor in the previous example, when asked, could say, I really believe in alternative medicine, so I personally would choose voodoo for my child. But he's telling you transparently what's going to take place. So, informed here means the capacity to do the proper level of analysis to understand the validity of the various options. Some may have more, some may have less, but that's what you're really providing to the client so he can make an intelligent decision. Not that one has a very strong opinion without the level of competency in the relevant data and methods. So, what is consent? Consent in this context means that the client is making a selection after the professional has provided the full benefit of his due diligence, judgment, and knowledge, or lack thereof. What does that mean? And it's very important. As I say, it's completely fine to say, I'm not qualified to render judgment regarding these options. This is very common in medicine or law or accounting. This is outside my expertise. Frankly, I know nothing about toxicology, so I don't know how to tell whether VOCs really make a difference or not. That's completely fine to say that. The problem with design professionals is that they tend to believe that nothing is outside their expertise. Witness the architecture firms that have produced, quote, research into healthy buildings, or the psychology of learning, or theories of design. Now, it's fine. I mean, we know that many, many different professions have detailed, what appear to be pseudo-academic journals and so forth and so on, what Hobbes used to call nonsense on stilts. But as a design professional, you have an independent duty to make sure you do the type of due diligence which demonstrates the skepticism that's necessary for you to carry out the duty that the state has given to you. Finally, and this is very important. I mean, any of us already know. I mean, I feel like when I talk about these things, it's completely common sense. It's of utmost importance that the professional is totally transparent to the client regarding conflicts of interest or advocacy positions. For example, our firm is committed to sustainability, and we try to get as many of our clients to fill in the blank, whatever it is, as we can, even if it costs them more money, time, or risk, and we can't provide a compelling objective argument for doing so. Now, you really don't want to say this. That's why you never want to be in a position where you have to be transparent about something like that. But the fact that this is what goes on sub rosa, unsaid, in many architecture firms is a problem. And given what I've seen over the years, this is a very common view. Because in fact, you can substitute a single word here and still get the same outcome. Our firm is committed to aesthetics, and we try to get as many of our clients to do modern architecture, do funky architecture, do deconstructive architecture as we can, even if it costs them more money, time, or risk, and we can't provide a compelling objective argument for doing so. Or, our quote, you have to be transparent, quote, our firm makes additional fees as a result of pursuing green rating system certifications. Now, of course, this is not much of an issue if you're being hired specifically to pursue those green rating certifications. But even then, such entities still need to be aware of the improper advocacy for points or options. Some points or options may lead to greater fees or greater benefits that could be conflict of interest. Certainly many of the engineering firms that were deeply involved with green and with various rating systems should have been saying this all along. Underfloor distribution comes to mind. So, transparency. Specifiers or design professionals can find themselves in difficult position if they are at odds in delivering objective advice and their employers or other consultants are pursuing advocacy. I know this is difficult. Your boss, your boss's boss, or some hotshot consultant. They're all after it. They're all making money. Boy, everybody thinks they're the best thing since sliced bread. But, of course, nobody said it was going to be easy, and that's why this is an ethical problem. So each licensed professional has his own obligation that can supersede his employee obligations. It's a difficult call. So do not confuse marketing and business development for the reality of a design professional's obligations to a client and public. Look, I know how it is at most firms. It's the same as at law firms. You could be a complete nincompoop, but if your uncle is a multi-billionaire and can bring in a hell of a lot of money, you're going to move up the ranks. So business development pays, moves you up the ranks. Marketing, all of this stuff is extremely important to getting work. I understand these things. But you also have to understand your duties and responsibilities to your client. In the same way that a doctor who's doing a study with a big pharma group could make a hell of a lot of money if the right data were to be sort of acquired through using you as a patient. And one of the things that we talk about is, what's the real value of preventing bird strikes and cost? Be transparent when you say, let's go for that point. What does that mean? Now, of course, you may say, hey, the client said, we want to be sustainable, so go get this. Remember, there's a distinct difference between informed consent and misinformed approval. You don't have to ask for the permission from your client or patient for every little thing that you do, but if it materially affects either their health, when you're talking about a physician, in a significant way, or the cost, schedule, risk of a project, you need to inform the owner fully. So the problem of transparency is always particularly difficult when using other people's money and they can't track it. Now this is a much longer discussion. There are at least 4 or 5 Nobel Prize winners in economics who work on this, but this is very difficult. Remember that. When you're spending other people's money and you're a design professional, you have certain obligations. One of them is to make sure you inform your client fully and get informed consent when it materially affects the use of those monies. So, the AIA has further weighed in on this and created even bigger problems for most people involved in this area. Mainly because they felt, the history of this is they felt somehow that they had gotten behind the curve in terms of the USGBC getting ahead of them, but that's a different issue. So licensed architects or members of the AIA are required to, quote, promote, advocate, and encourage the sustainable design of buildings and communities, as well as try and encourage their clients to do the same. This is part of your code of ethics. I give you the reference here. This is very bizarre. I especially like that you're supposed to encourage your clients to do the same. As though you need to do proselytizing. That's what this is about. A professional is not a proselytizer. A professional is paid for services to provide information, and the right kind of information with appropriate due diligence, and to use their judgments in a manner which will benefit the client or the patient, or however you want to see it. So then the AIA in the B101 2007 goes even further. The architect shall consider environmentally responsible design alternatives consistent with the owner's program schedule and budget. Now, of course, the fact that we don't know what environmental means here, responsible means here, design means here, makes it pretty tricky, let alone alternatives. Consistent with the owner's program schedule and budget. Well, that's a tough row to hoe. And as I said, this is a sort of non-legalese thing that I'm trying to do, so I won't go into all the implications. But you can see where, you know, sophisticated attorneys will strike these types of clauses. So, and I know that I promised this in the description. I want to talk a little bit about the health claims. I want to talk a little bit about productivity claims. I want to talk a little bit about asset claims. Let me just talk very generally about these areas for a second. First, one of the biggest difficulties is if you do not have some significant training either in the sciences or in statistics, it is very, very hard for you to make sense of whether a study actually makes any sense or not. So the fact that a study happens, as I said earlier, to comport with one's own personal views is very common as the basis of thinking that the study is a good one. In general, this is called validation bias. There's also a second very important bias that operates in this area, which is called publication bias. For every 500 stories that say, you know, green has wonderful outcomes and you know, we think that it does this, that, and the other, and you know, it makes people healthier, wealthier, and wiser, there'll be one small study somewhere that's done clearly that says, wait a minute, that may not be the case. Those studies are rarely published. It's the same thing in medicine. It's the same thing in lots of other stuff. Something that says, oh, we've got a cure for cancer, 5,000 people report on it. But the second study that says, oh, we thought there was a cure for cancer, but no, in fact, there isn't, rarely gets the same kind of press. And this is not an evil thing that the press is engaged in or whatever, or some kind of systemic thing. It's just that naturally you sell more product, or you are able to disseminate your media piece further. And this is a very common thing, very well known, and one of the systemic things that are dealt with both in medicine and in other areas. In fact, there are whole conferences that deal with these types of biases and how to eliminate those biases. So especially when you're talking about the studies, when you're dealing with health concerns, you're in some deep and dark and murky waters if you don't have the kind of capacity to do the due diligence and research. So most of you have read what's on the screen already, but you know, without some knowledge of toxicology, epidemiology, biostatistics, and of course underlying medicine, there's very little that can be said. Very little that can be said. At best, what you would be able to say is, really, I don't know about this, but there's this study that says this, and I don't even know if that study's any good. So, now red lists are a particularly difficult problem in this area. And there's a whole bunch of things, unfortunately, in this area that depend on the precautionary principle, and the red lists are one of these. The precautionary principle is at the basis of much of the activity that takes place in a certain type of green or sustainable action. And in fact, the precautionary principle has fatal flaws to it. We're going to go into that in just a second, but you should realize that the precautionary principle requires proof of the negative. The system, product, chemical, or technology does no harm. This is impossible to fulfill. This is like saying, and I'll use this example later, that cheese causes no harm. That you need to prove to me that cheese will never harm anybody before we will allow you to sell cheese. Now this is great for advocates because the burden of the proof is on the cheesemaker. You have to show that cheese or cars or, you know, football, for example, will never cause harm before you're allowed to use it or play the game or do whatever it is. Unfortunately, this is, as I said, great for advocates, but terrible for society and the lost benefits of technologies and other opportunities. And here's how it normally works. Normally when you're trying to understand, you know, danger, as it were, that's hazard. I'm sorry, it shouldn't be plus, it should be hazard times risk. And the precautionary principle refuses to use risk. It says if there's a hazard, there's a danger, and because there's a danger, usually it's couched as because there could be potential for great danger, we must ban it. We must stop it. It's preventing harm. Of course, it's not very clear whether it's preventing harm, such as using nanotechnology, where it's preventing some harm, but nanotechnology may hold the key to potentially limitless energy, which you would never get to. So what you realize is that the precautionary principle doesn't understand the balancing of risk and benefits. So it doesn't know how to do a risk-adjusted cost-benefit analysis. I'm just going to give you a couple examples here. I know we're getting close to the end of time, so I've only got about 5 more minutes, but I should be able to get done. Let me just do this quickly. Recommending the use of a red list without letting the client know that the data and methodology used by advocates is not objective creates a problem. This is really crucial, because what is necessary is it's fine to advocate as long as you say, look, this is my opinion, I don't know, it's outside of my expertise, but for some reason I want to use a red list. Will you go along with me, Mr. Client or Mr. Patient? You should also inform the client that rating systems are products. The lead system is not a standard. These things are not standards. They do not fulfill the governance transparency requirements of ASTM, ANSI, or ISO. And they are in fact purchasing a product. As a specifier, it's your job to oversee the way in which products are dealt with. So, I give you just a couple examples. Cheese, beer, wine, medicine would all be banned using the precautionary principle. Imagine if you had to say that your medicine had to prove that it absolutely caused zero harm before it would ever be used. Now, I don't know about you, but certainly myself and most of my immediate family would be in deep trouble if this were the case. Most medicines have side effects. That's why you have to do a balancing. What are the benefits? What are the risks under conditions of uncertainty? Asthma is a great example of this. Perkins and Will and others claim that by using precautionary principle red list, they can improve IAQ in asthma and other diseases. But the causes of asthma are puzzling even to the specialists in the area. Frankly, the fastest way that you could prevent asthma would be to give points for banning pets. In the sort of standardized curve, bell curve for things that affect asthma, most experts are in agreement that pets are a much greater cause of asthma attacks than anything else. And at the tails are claims about certain types of chemicals that may do this. So you're actually attacking something that has a very small percentage chance of improving asthma, when there's more than enough evidence to suggest there are other ways to do it. In fact, one of the oddest little pieces of data, you may be amused by this, both in Detroit, I think it's Detroit and Cleveland if I'm not mistaken, I can get you the references as necessary, in the wintertime particularly, airborne bacteria in Cleveland, Detroit, the primary airborne bacteria is fecal bacteria from dogs. Now, it's significantly more particulate matter than lots of the stuff that we're talking about on the red list. And yet that's not even accounted for. And that's because red lists and a number of these other things are really from a long tradition of a kind of one might almost call it a neo-Luddite view that chemicals are evil. One of the most interesting things is that indoor air quality and energy efficiency are at odds in many cases. There's significant evidence to show that tighter buildings cause increase in asthma. And The most interesting part, of course, is that when you have IAQ and energy efficiency at odds with each other, you'll often have to make a balancing decision. The most interesting issues here is influenza. And then finally, bioaerosolization via green roofs and indoor living walls in locations with compromised population. Aspergillosis. There's a whole series of other kinds of bioaerosolization of bacteria, of molds, of mildews, especially in compromised populations where we're talking about hospitals. I mean, you don't want a green roof on a hospital. You don't want a living wall in a hospital. Interestingly enough, the use of these types of green roofs or living walls and bacterial infiltration are an exclusion under most insurance policies. So if people were to be injured or to die as a result of this, and aspergillosis is extremely deadly to compromised populations, the building owner is not covered. So now, let me just do this last couple of things for productivity and asset valuation. I see I'm at the end of my time, but one of the things to realize with productivity is that attempts to measure productivity of workers have been going on for over 100 years. Not with a lot of success, except when you're dealing with industrial organization and piece workers versus service workers and professionals. There's no clear way to measure productivity of professionals, or in most cases, service workers. Currently, it's mostly done with what are called post-occupancy evaluations, and these are just downright notorious for being biased and inadequate. The fundamental GSA studies that were written by Kamshur on this are completely problematized by this, and so are virtually all of the Carnegie Mellon studies. And this is often used as the basis for much of this. For those of you who are interested, contingent valuation analysis, which is used by economists, which is a similar technique, often shows this huge gap between the willingness to pay ex ante and ex post, which is very similar to post-occupancy evaluations, which is when you talk to people after the fact, they're willing to say all kinds of things that they don't really believe, but they think they should be saying. I'm strong in my wording here, but any of you who know the Greg Katz fundamental studies realize, or know anything about statistics, understands that they're absurd in terms of their claims about productivity and health benefits of green buildings. They're purely speculative without any data whatsoever. And ultimately, one of the things that you've got to really deal with is productivity is a result of many factors that are likely to be more important than IAQ or greenness of a space. A lot of work has been done on this: job dissatisfaction, disliking the boss, shirking. These are all very, very powerful in terms of decreasing productivity and have nothing to do with whether the person feels warm and cozy inside their building. And finally, a slide on asset valuation. I can go into much more detail on this, and I'm actually anxious. I was going to put together a detailed bibliography, but it got to be too long. I'm more than happy to, you've got my contact info for you, any of you, to contact me in terms of having a conversation about the various other kinds of studies and analyses and further information that was used for this talk. So in any case, asset valuation claims. Now I've done, regression analysis of residential areas and of other areas in this particular field, and I can tell you there is no good evidence for increased valuation of the asset. These are anecdotal and are often highly confused. In fact, Jones Lang LaSalle and many others who are major players in the industry know that there's no hard evidence for this. Now, there may be many people who think that there's some valuation benefit for marketing or branding reasons, but it's still anecdotal and not particularly useful. There will be upcoming studies that confirm, using extremely high N values, that, in fact, the data will come from the New York set, where every building over 50,000 square feet was required to have an Energy Star, sets of Energy Star information filed with the city of New York. A particular professor of physics has done this analysis where he segregated out the lead buildings and their Energy Star ratings, and he will be able to show, it's out for final publication review with a third-party credible institution, that there is no correlation between having a lead building and the actual energy performance of the building. And in fact, there's no correlation between having high Energy Star scores and the energy performance of the building. This will have some significant impact on claims that you can make. Frankly, now that you've been to my talk, you can't claim this to anybody else, that the performance of LEED buildings really, that LEED is a proxy for the performance of building, or the Green Globes or Energy Star or any of those. So having said all of that, and I'm sure there are many of you who feel you'd like to get some questions in here, please feel free to ask those questions at this time.
Yushval, thank you very much. One quick question. I think with all the LEED projects we've been involved with, there's a meeting with the owner, and the owner wants to know why. And then ultimately you can even get into the credits and the cost for each one, because they may have their own marketing or real estate or competitive reason. But then when it gets down to an individual credit like certified wood, you can be green, you can meet the LEED requirement with FSC certification, you could go outside with an SFI certification, but certainly the design professionals are able to make those decisions without, I think, really worrying about whether, once the owner is directed it's a LEED project, isn't part of the advocacy part over? And then it's just a matter of meeting the owner's requirements.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that everybody is very clear about that, one, and then two, that there are ways in which various point selections within going to get the LEED certification, you want to be careful not to be advocating for those. You want to be making sure that, okay, you've talked to your client has decided, they're going to go for LEED certification. That's fine, you've been given a directive to do so. Then what you need to do is to say, as I'm sure you do, Mark, I don't doubt that at all, but that, okay, we could go for this point, it's going to cost you this much, we can go for this, it's going to cost you this much, but not to get into a situation where, what version 4 might come out and say, well, we want red lists, this, that, or the other, or we want to go for fighting obesity. You need to be careful how you phrase and act as an advocate for the different options that are to be chosen.
Matt, are there questions?
We have one question that actually relates directly to what you were just talking about here from Paul, and he was stating that in his experience, red lists are usually imposed by the owner on the design professional. Does the design professional have a responsibility to push against an owner's advocacy if he or she has doubts?
Well, let's put it this way. If the design professional, just as a physician, if the patient says, I want to do voodoo, and the doctor says, well, I'm not sure that's a great idea, in the end, you're going to accede to the client's wishes. But obviously, if you do not give them the benefit of your knowledge and your judgment in the area, then by omission, you may be creating a situation in which, you should have at least tried to say something. I'm not saying that you have to actively fight it, but you need to make it clear that if a client says we're going to pursue the red list, and it's coming down as a directive from some marketing person or whatever, you might just want to ask, well, could you give us some more information why you selected that? Or in our experience, it's unclear what the value is of a red list or something like that. Obviously, what you're really trying to do is to give them the benefit of your knowledge and your skepticism. As a specifier, that's the same thing you would do in any case, right? If a client said, okay, oh yeah, we're going to specify X, I'm like, well, yeah, you could do that, but let me just give you the benefit of my experience over the last 15 years. Every time you specify that with this other assembly system nearby, it creates a problem. So give them the benefit of your knowledge. And if you don't have the knowledge, then, say, I don't know, okay, we'll do the red list because we've been directed to do so. Remember that you can make errors both by commission and omission. Right? So not saying something can be as much of a problem as saying something. That's why you need really to be careful about how you proceed if you think you're going to do advocacy. And of course, I assume that nobody who's on this call has any problems with these issues, right? It's you probably attended this because you thought it was of interest.
Thank you, Yushval, for your comments over the last few minutes. And Yushval, it is certainly an important issue that an architect has responsibility to separate out their own views and what's best for the project. And hopefully that's something that they taught us in school and taught us in practice.
But we do have one final quick question here. I think that Maybe Ujjwal, you can do it in a yes, no, and maybe a small statement to it coming from George, asking, what's your opinion on the basis of HPDs? They seem to be advocacy tools, but should they be relied on?
I'm sorry, basis of what? I didn't quite hear you.
Environmental product declarations?
Oh, right. You know, I didn't want to get too deeply into that, as I didn't want to get too deeply into Bs. There are some difficulties with environmental product declarations because the underlying ways in which you establish the boundaries of what constitutes the data pool can often be problematic. I'll give you, you know what, I'd love, George, please, you've got my information. I'd love to talk in more detail about that. I don't want to take up everybody's time at this moment to do it. And I'm happy to talk to anybody else about more information and data pools and so forth. And frankly, I'd be anxious to do that if anybody has an interest. So, George, feel free. I think I also gave a phone number, so, I mean, heck, if you feel that, you know, so motivated, just feel free to give me a buzz, and I'd be happy to talk more about it. But both of them have their own issues. The Bs tool particularly has some fundamental fatal flaws, and the Bs tool and the way in which you get the environmental product declarations, they share some similar methodological difficulties.
Just a clarification, George had mentioned he was specific about the health product declarations, the newer content that's coming out, the HPDs.
You know, I'm not familiar with that. You'll have to tell me more about it, but I'm curious because especially if they're going to start to make health ones, that's very puzzling. Who's issuing this? Is UL issuing these? Sorry, George is on the line. So.
Well, no, it sounds like the topic for sometime in the next few months.
Be happy to do it, because if the claim that you're going to do a health version of this is deeply puzzling. Right? It'd be interesting just to know who's issuing these things, because sometimes that's what gives you the clue as to what the shtick actually is.
But I guess if Mark or Ujjwal, if you have any last-minute comments, I don't have any more questions coming in right now. I'll let you both wrap up with today.
I don't have anything more except just to thank people for their time.
And thank you as well. We're always looking for new topics, whether it's half a session, a whole session. So if you'd like to present, be part of a presentation, please stay in touch with me or Richard Moore or Matt at CSI. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate your attendance.